Hello! Have you ever wanted to learn how to play chess? Well, I assume so, because you're here watching this video. And good, it's a great game, you should learn how to play. This tutorial is going to be broken up into separate videos, all put into a How to Play Chess playlist. And in another one, we're going to be talking about more complicated things like checkmate, stalemate, en passant, and castling, all that fun stuff. But this video is going to be focusing more on the basics, looking at the board, the pieces, how they move, and how they capture one another. Let's jump in. All right, let's start off by just looking at a blank board here. We see it's broken up into 64 squares. Half of them are light squares and half of them are dark squares. You see the diagonals are all going to be the same color, so this is a dark square diagonal, this is a light square diagonal. We also have to remember that the bottom right corner is a light square. That's important if you're setting up a physical board because you would need to make sure it's not flipped the wrong direction. So if it helps you remember, you can think white on right. Just this bottom right corner here is going to be a light square. We also see here on the bottom, we have all these numbers going A through H, and here 1 through 8. That is so that we can name the squares, similar to Battleship. So this square here is C3, going C on the C file in the third rank. This square is F7, B8. So that way we can say the name of a square without actually having to physically put a piece there. I can say a piece is going to A8 without actually moving the piece, and you can tell where I'm talking about. This is how the board looks like when it's set up with actual pieces at the beginning of a game, but for now let's just take a look at each of them and how they all move. This right here is a king. Kings can move in one square any direction. So all of these squares here, the king can move to, and we do that just by picking up the king and moving it to one of those squares. So the king here cannot go to D7 because that's 2 squares away. First it would have to go to a square closer to that, and then go to D7 on the next turn. The board will always have a white king and a black king, and it's important to note that the kings can never be right next to each other like this, because they'd be checking each other. We'll get into that later. For now, you just have to remember they can never be right next to each other like this, either this way or diagonally. They can never be right next to each other. They always have to have at least one square between them like this or like this. They can never do this. This right here is a rook. Rooks kind of look like a castle, and they can move any number of squares in these directions, going up, down, left, and right, kind of like a plus. Rooks cannot jump over any pieces. In fact, most pieces can't. So if there was a piece here on E6, the rook could not travel all the way to E8. But if there's nothing obstructing the piece, then it can travel the entire length of the board. So the rook can go here all the way down, and then it could go all the way to A8, like this, and all the way down to A1, just like that. This is a bishop. Bishops can move any number of squares along the diagonals, like this. So you see here, this bishop can only ever travel on the light squares, so we call it a light squared bishop. Because if it stays on the diagonal, it's never going to be able to get to a dark square because, well, we see all the diagonals are the same color. They're all going to be light squares or dark squares. So we start off the game with a light squared bishop and a dark squared bishop. So you see this one travels on the dark squares, this one travels on the light squares. This is the queen, and the queen is generally considered to be the most powerful piece in the game of chess, and that's because it can move like a rook and a bishop combined. So we see here it can move like a rook, but it can also travel along the diagonals like a bishop, just like this. So we can see all these squares that the queen can travel to. So if the queen wanted to go all the way down here and then all the way along this diagonal, it is slightly different than a bishop because it can go on any color. So we see here the diagonals, it can go on the light squares, but if we move the queen down to a dark square, now the queen can go on these dark square diagonals. So it's not limited to one color complex like the bishop. This horsey guy right here is called a knight. Knights ride on horses. You can remember it that way. Knights are a little bit tricky, and that's because they move in this weird L shape. Let me do it this way so it's a little more clear. See how it's going like an L? It goes 2 squares in one direction and 1 square over. So it can go this way, it can go this way, as long as it's 2 squares and 1 over in any direction. So we can highlight all the squares the knight can jump to. So in the center of the board, the knight can jump to 8 squares, just like this. If the knight is on the edge of the board, there's a saying that goes, knights on the rim are dim. And that's because if we look at all the squares the knight can go to here, it's cut down to half. It can only jump to 4 squares. So generally, the knight is better in the center of the board because it has access to all 8 of those squares. Another thing to note about the knight is that it can actually jump over other pieces. And it's the only piece that can do this. Any other piece, if it's obstructed, it can't go past that obstruction. It has to stop there. But the knight, see how it's kind of trapped in with all these pieces? It can actually jump over this wall of pawns, just like that. Pawns are the last piece we need to look at. They can move 1 square forward unless it's their first move of the game. So pawns here, you can see they start on the 2nd rank and the 7th rank for black. On their first move, they can move 1 square forward, or they can move 2 squares forward. Kind of like a swimmer, you know, gets on their starting platform, they kind of push off and get that little jump start. It's kind of like that. So on the first move, pawns can move 2 squares forward, black can respond. And even though it's not the first move of the game, see this pawn on c2, it hasn't moved yet, though. It's still on its starting square, so it can move 1 or 2 squares forward, just like this. But after that, pawns can only move 1 square. So if this pawn moves 2 squares, and then on its next turn, if it wants to move 1 square, it can do that. If the pawn makes it to the end of the board, we have what's called pawn promotion. And that's where you can promote this pawn to a bishop, a knight, a rook, or a queen. Usually you want to promote it to a queen because it's the most powerful piece. There are certain occasions where you would want to promote to something else, but usually you just promote it to a queen. Pawns can never move backwards, so you have to remember that. They can only move forward until they make it to the end of the board and promote to a different piece. Now that we've seen how all the pieces move, let's take a look at how they can capture one another. Generally, if a piece can move onto a square that a piece lies, then it can capture that piece. So this king here, see how it can move onto the square? It can just capture the knight just like this. Now, there would be a different case where if, let's say, this king were here, remember that kings can never be right next to each other, so this king actually can't capture the knight. See, it won't even let me make this move because the kings can never go there. So if the piece can move to that square, it can capture the piece. But since the king can't move to d5, we can't take the knight. But otherwise, if this were the position, we can be free to capture this piece. If we take a look at this position, we see we have a queen, a pawn, and a knight, and the 2 kings. Let me ask you a question. Can the queen capture this pawn? No, because the queen cannot move onto that square. It's not on a diagonal or going straight like this. Can the queen capture the knight? Yes, because the queen can travel along this diagonal and capture the knight. And then let's say black makes a move, then we can capture this pawn by going this way, just like that. Here we have the 2 kings, a bishop, and a rook, and the bishop travels along the diagonals, so we see that the bishop can take the rook. Here we have 2 kings, a pawn, and a rook. If we remember how the rook moves like this, we see that the rook can capture the pawn just by going all the way down and taking that piece. Now here's a question. Can the knight capture the black bishop? Well, not right now, because the knight doesn't travel like this. It travels in this weird kind of L shape, right? So if we wanted to capture the bishop, then the knight would have to first move to a different square. So let's say black makes a move and white goes here. Now we are attacking the bishop. And let's say black doesn't see that, moves the king again. Then we can just pick up the knight and take the bishop. Here's another tricky one. Can the knight capture the bishop in this position? Yes, it can. And that's because the knight, if we remember, can jump over other pieces. So we see, even though there's this wall of pawns here, the knight can jump over them and capture this bishop. Pawns are a little tricky in how they capture other pieces. And that's because, remember how they move forward, but the pawns do not capture forward. They actually just capture 1 square diagonal like this. So we see this rook is 1 square diagonal from the pawn, so the pawn can capture the rook. If the rook were here, the pawn is blockaded. So the pawn cannot actually move forward at all. It can't capture the rook because it captures on these squares. So the rook would have to be on one of those squares for the pawn to capture it. Here we have a position with 2 kings, a bunch of pawns, and 2 rooks. These rooks are staring at each other, and that just means that, they're threatening to capture one another. Let's say white wants to capture the black rook, so we take it, and black's pawns march down this way. For us, our pawns are moving forward, but remember there's another player on the other side playing with black, so for them, these pawns are going forward even though they're coming backwards for our perspective. So remember how pawns capture one square ahead of them diagonally, and the rook is on one of those squares. So if we go back here, we can see that this rook is defended by this pawn. And that means we can recapture the rook if the rook is captured, which we did. We took the rook, and then we can recapture it with the pawn. So it's an equal trade. We traded rooks. We each lost the same piece. So here the rook is defended. We can take it. Black can recapture, just like this. Okay, so that's the basics of the game of chess, how the pieces move, how they capture one another. In the next video, we'll be going over some things that are a little more complicated, like the goal of the game, checkmate, stalemate, en passant, castling, all that fun stuff. I'll see you then.